Welcome to the third debate of the battle over scientific information strand. This one's entitled Science Journalism, the Tyranny of Evidence. I'm really pleased to have with me, furthest from my left, we have Mark Henderson, who's Head of Communications at the Wellcome Trust, and he's the author of the Geek Manifesto. Next to him, immediate to my left, we have Dr. Jamie White, who's a philosopher and writer. He's the author of Crimes Against Logic and Quack Policy. On my immediate right, I have Hannah Devlin, who's a science editor at The Times. Next to her, we have Tom Chivers, who's an assistant comment editor at The Daily Telegraph, who writes widely on science topics. And furthest from me, we have Dr. Michael Fitzpatrick, who's a GP, and he's the author of Defeating Autism, A Damaging Illusion, and The Tyranny of Health, Doctors and the Regulation of Lifestyle. So welcome to my panel. So science journalism sometimes comes in for a bad rap. You know, they can be blamed for panics, misinformation, accused of false balance, sometimes even making things up. And the kind of list of problems in the media can sometimes seem endless. MMR, climate change, the Daily Mail's infamous cancer stories, all can build up a picture of science journalism that is really not being done properly, some might say. This discussion as well also happens in the shadow of the Leveson inquiry. There, as part of that report, he did include a set of draft guidelines which he proposed be discussed and possibly implemented by media outlets, specifically for the reporting of science. I'm going to ask my panel, first of all, is looking back at the MMR scandal when it was full-blown, and then more recently when The Independent put Wakefield back on the front page, and actually that caused an outcry in itself. Was that a sign of science journalism being done better? I mean, have we got a better handle on it? Who wants to start with that? Tom?
All right. But it's a sad fact that journalists aren't very good with numbers. I've got a really good friend of mine, who I won't name, but she. Do you remember a few years ago there was that Russian satellite that was falling out of the sky, and everyone was, will it land on a major? And she read the figure that there's a 1 in 20,000 chance that it'll hit someone, and she put, oh wow, that means that it's 3 times as more likely to get killed by this satellite than you are by getting hit by a bus. Well, no, this is your chance of getting hit by someone getting hit by this satellite, as opposed to one of you 6 billion people and one person getting hit by a bus. It's not how it works. It's just complete failure of understanding. And the trouble is, there's no shame. There's no sort of not the same sense of shame that there is about saying when you say I'm no good at maths, I'm no good at science. There's not the same sort of sense of shame about it as there is saying I'm no good at art, I'm no good at I don't understand English, anything like that. So I think that is where the sort of root of all this problem has happened. But I do think the problem's been getting better in the last few years. The Emma Market thing is a case in point. No one seemed to care that journalists were sort of fundamentally misunderstanding scientific evidence. The idea that they could take a simple story, person A had the jab and then got ill and put no idea into whether or not there's a causal link. And I think that certainly in the time I've been in journalism, which is only 6 years or so, it's become much more, this is ironically it's anecdotal evidence, I realise, but it's become much more acceptable, much more unacceptable to think like that. And I think people like Mark and people like Ben Goldacre have sort of spawned 1,000 people like them, and now journalism schools have teach data journalism and all that sort of stuff. I think, generally speaking, the situation has improved. It's still pretty bad, and you still get those awful fake formulae things and those terrible PR surveys, which loads of women. You won't get a job if you don't wear makeup, says survey for a makeup firm. So there's still a long way to go. There's still some dreadful examples of science journalism that's sort of dressed up as science, and it's hard to distinguish in the papers from real science. But it is getting better, and what we need to work on, in my opinion, is making it more and more embarrassing for journalists and people in general to say, I don't know anything about science, doesn't matter to me. I think that's the key. Shame them, basically.
Yeah, so Tom attributed the improvement partly to you and others. Is that what's made better? Just people being more willing to be vocal about what's going wrong?
Well, I was actually going to start by pointing out that, well, I did Hannah's job until about 20 months ago, and so obviously things have clearly improved greatly in the intervening time since I stopped being a science journalist. But
I think say the opposite.
Yeah, but to build on, and I mean, I agree, I think, with most of what Tom said there. I think one of the really stark things that actually illustrates how bad things were with the press back in the early 2000s, and when I actually started writing about science for the Times, was that in 2002, the British Press Awards gave their Health Writer of the Year award to a woman called Lorraine Fraser, who wrote for the Sunday Telegraph, who was Andrew Wakefield's chief cheerleader in the media. The way in which she was misleading about science was not only seen as okay, it was actually seen by the profession as something to be celebrated. And I don't think that that is the case anymore. It'd be very interesting to hear Mike's perspective as somebody who was very much a combatant in the MMR wars at the time. So I think things have definitely improved. I wouldn't say there are no problems at all. There are very many problems that continue. But I think what Tom said at the end is actually the key. It's about making people, I think, creating a cost to doing science journalism badly. One of the reasons why a lot of the press goes for the sensationalist, one of the reasons a lot of the media, it's not just the press, goes for the sensationalist headline, the misleading spin, the false balance, is because it makes for a more lively discussion, a more interesting story. If there's no cost to doing that badly, if there's not seen as a demand for that stuff done well, done accurately, then people will continue to do it. So I'm very much of the view that actually the solution to better science journalism and better science reporting is a demand-led one, not a supply-led one. It's less regulation. It's less regulation than it is education in a way. And I would add to that yes, it's naming and shaming and it's making people embarrassed, but it's also helping out. And I think one of the main reasons why actually science journalism has improved so much is actually the scientific community have come to value the importance of making themselves available to reporters. Things like the Science Media Centre and Sense About Science have made a great difference there. And I think most reporters do want to get it right. And I'll just finish, if I may, just by telling a quick story about my first couple of months. I think it was about 2 months into my job writing about science on the Times as a history graduate in 2000 with really no background in it at all. And I wrote a story picking up on a New Scientist report about the predecessor to the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, which was about to be shut down and hadn't found the Higgs boson. And I wrote a story picking up from New Scientist about how this showed that it was all a gigantic waste of money. And this physicist at Oxford, Tony Weidberg, wrote me the most brilliant email saying, actually, you know what, your story was pretty crap, actually, and there was a lot of stuff that you simply got wrong in it. And he said, but rather than rant and rave about it, he followed that up by saying, yeah, but you know what, particle physics is hard, and it's not surprising that people like you make mistakes about it from time to time. And why don't you come up and visit me and my colleagues at Oxford and spend a day with us? You'll make some contacts. We'll be able to help you out in the future when you're writing about this. And I bit his arm off. And it turned what could have been a very confrontational and negative experience for both of us actually into a positive experience for both of us. That didn't mean I didn't make any more mistakes, but certainly meant that I made fewer of them. And I think that approach is actually really important.
Mike, I think you were...
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about the MMR wars, about which I know more than any human being should ever have to know. Tom talked about the root of the problem. I do think we need to try and put it in a bit of a wider context, the problem of science journalism, because I think there is a wider context, and it starts from just identifying the fact of this preoccupation with evidence-based policy is a very novel phenomenon. You know, if you look back to when Beveridge and Attlee and Bevan introduced the welfare state, they didn't claim that it was based on scientific evidence or scientific research. You know, they justified it by the ideology of new liberalism or the ideology of state socialism and on the authority of the Liberal Party and the post-war Labour government. That was the basis on which they motivated that major introduction of government policy. When Margaret Thatcher and her colleagues set about dismantling the welfare state, they didn't claim randomised controlled trials had shown the benefits of their particular policy. It was justified in terms of unleashing the free market, anti-state, monetarism, and all those familiar doctrines. Now, whatever you think about them, you know, that was what the debate about policy was about then. And I think what we've seen since then is the demise of ideological, political controversy as the major determinant of policy and as the source of authority of government, and the ascendancy of scientific evidence as other forms of authority have been discredited. It's almost like science is the last man standing in terms of legitimising government policy. And that we see a sort of outsourcing of government authority to science in all areas. So if you're introducing a new social policy or a new educational policy or a new health policy, some sort of scientific expert, some sort of scientific research has got to be produced to justify it. And one of the most striking measures of that, actually, that this thing even affects anybody who is opposed to the mainstream drift of policy, and even from the most unlikely areas. For example, in the recent controversy over abortion in Ireland, where you might think that the Catholic Church would justify its opposition to the measures on the grounds of some theological argument. No, it's actually justified in terms of a scientific medical argument that abortion causes higher incidence of post-traumatic stress disorder or arguments of that sort. So in other words, even opponents of scientific issues couch their arguments in terms of science. The religious fundamentalists have spawned the idea of creation science to legitimise their position. You know, fundamentalist religious people did not used to justify their arguments in terms of a science. Now, science rules everything, so whether you're on one side of the argument or another, you've got to put it in scientific terms. So the consequence of all this is that science has been remorselessly politicised and moralised, and that's created tremendous problems for the way in which science is dealt with, and it's created great problems for the media. And I think that's the context in which we have to discuss. That's what the burden that's been put on science. I mean, people think that science is becomes so influential because Brian Cox is rather sexy on television and Dara Ó Briain is, quite funny. That this is why science has suddenly become fashionable. It's because everything else has collapsed. Science is the only thing left, and science is having to do the burden of justifying everything else and justifying every intervention in every area of social policy and almost public life.
Following on from Mike, I mean, I'd agree that science has become something that's lent on a lot more, and part of that is because we have sort of new ways of being able to deal with large quantities of data and to be able to use those to sort of design policies around them. But I think that, in a sense, from a media point of view, means there's a new appetite for people who understand that and who are able to wade through those figures and use them to hold governments to account and companies and so on. So I think maybe we're in a phase where we're kind of catching up with the way data is being used now and science is being used to support political decisions and so on. So I think in the long term that could be a really good thing for science reporting if we have more people in newsrooms who have an understanding of figures. And as Tom was saying, that can be a problem. But if you have a newspaper newsroom which is populated with people who need to understand those things, then I think that will filter through and have a positive impact in the end. And I think as well, there's such a rich media landscape now with so many different outlets for writing about science news and the science behind policy and so on, that I think in some senses it's harder to get away with the kind of stuff that was going on at the time of the MMR controversy. And I think that is starting to have an effect. I mean, people don't want to be featured in Ben Goldacre's Bad Science column or, featured in, sort of attacked by bloggers. So I think people are conscious of that to some extent when they're reporting science, and I think that's had a really positive impact too. Those are my thoughts.
This role of of science and public policy is it is undermining, I think, people's understanding of science, and this is partly because politicians and some journalists and campaigners are using, as was said, they're using scientists or scientists as the last authority, the last thing we must now defer to. Scientific opinions are put forward, and we're told, for example, that it's a scientific consensus, or that it's, only if some kind of a nut job would question this stuff. And they talk about, you'll notice that people always talk about science has discovered, or scientists say, as if science is a unitary thing. But in fact, science encompasses a great many disciplines, and only some of them produce reliable results. In fact, most sciences that are kind of live and hot issues are young, poorly confirmed, and the results issuing from them are you should be properly skeptical of. Not, let's say, standard physics, standard chemistry. Even some of the fringe bits of physics still something you should be skeptical about. But many branches of science, let's take behavioral economics, which is used as the basis for a lot of public policy. Climatology. These are immature sciences. They have virtually no serious results. Look at physics. We're in a building held up by physics. We watch things recorded on one side of the world instantaneously on the other side of the world, beamed by satellites. We can put people on the moon. This is very, very impressive. So we rightly think, well, these physicists know what they're doing. Other fields of science have no such history of success. And yet we're asked to defer to them in the same way that we would to physicists. And I just want to very quickly say why I think, and I fear that science journalists are very prone to this. They become cheerleaders for science. Even, in fact, in an odd way, the slightly better informed they are, because only half informed, they can never be really the scientists in the field, that they're more inclined to play this role. And it's very important for people getting peddled this science stuff all the time about why you've got to accept it and roll with the policy agenda, to bear in mind that scientists there are many reasons they exaggerate the confidence due to their theories, but the main one is that they're interested parties. Take an economist, economic forecasting, the kind of thing that goes on at the Bank of England. Their results are persistently wrong, by the way. I mean, dramatically wrong and persistently wrong, but the Bank of England never stops issuing them. You ask them, well, how good is your science? I mean, how solid are these theories, these models? How reliable are they? Now, do you think that the modelers at the Bank of England are likely to understate or overstate the level of confidence due to their models? I mean, they're employed on the basis of these models. It's the same with all scientists. They are natural lobbyists for their branch of science. And I don't just mean this in a kind of corrupt way, like that they get an income from it. More importantly, I think, in immature areas of science, you have taken a kind of a punt as a scientist. It's a bit like starting a new business. You're leaping in at the deep end. You don't really know if it's going to work out. And you need to be fired up to do it in a certain way. You need to have a high level of confidence. And it's only the people who do have a slightly exaggerated level of confidence that are going to do this, right? It naturally selects people like that into this field. In immature sciences, those scientists are natural enthusiasts for their subject. This is actually probably has a useful function in science. It creates lots of fields of endeavor and lots of experiments, so to speak, and provided we can eliminate the ones that go wrong, there's no harm done in the long run. But what we mustn't do is assume that because they wear white coats and are employed in university departments, the same level of confidence in their theoretical ideas, we should have as much confidence in their ideas as we do in, let's say, central physics. And this failure to communicate the wildly different levels of confidence due to different branches of science, I think is currently the biggest mistake polluting public discussion of science.
So Mark, Tom said science is hard. We've heard science is hard. And you mentioned it's useful to have scientists out there that you can reach out to and talk to when you're finding things difficult to understand or need an interpretation. Based on what Jamie said, is there a danger that a journalist can't be in a position to be properly sceptical of what a scientist is telling them?
I think good journalism is always sceptical and always attempts to convey the uncertainty. And where I would certainly agree with what Jamie's just said is that often one of the ways in which science is reported badly is when uncertainty is poorly conveyed. And not all journalists are good at conveying uncertainty. It's also very true that a lot of politicians and public officials prefer a more certain line than a more uncertain one. And I think where I think I can draw a lot of agreement with you, Jamie, there is certainly over, say, if you're looking at climate science as an example, actually the basic physics of climate science, that carbon dioxide will lead to a greenhouse effect, and the more carbon dioxide and methane and water vapor you pump out, the warmer the world will get. That's actually basic chemistry and physics. That's not really desperately controversial among anybody. The question of exactly what effects that will have and when and what the impact of that will be is obviously a much more uncertain game. There is a genuine consensus over the parameters of that, but those parameters are fairly broad. And I do certainly think that the association that has often come up there between sort of buying global warming, therefore buying a certain set of solutions to global warming, is sometimes an erroneous one. But that also turns on its head. Very often what you get, particularly in the media over climate change, is people who don't like the economic solutions that are advanced to climate change then going after the science, not actually because they are actually particularly expert in the science or really forensically deconstructing the science, but because they have decided a priori, because they don't like a particular set of solutions, that they're going to go after the science. I think the way we get away from that actually is to try to separate the two issues, that you have the science and then you have the policy informed of science. And where again I think I'd agree with Jamie and Mike on this is that it is actually very important that you acknowledge that scientific evidence is only one strand of the factors that need to be taken into account when making good public policy. What I think you're often talking about here is actually not what I would describe as evidence-based policy, but what I would describe as policy-based evidence. This is the evidence that's cherry-picked to support a course of action you were always going to go for everywhere. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes the opposite can happen, Jamie, as well, where scientists can be taken for a ride a bit, and in the case of climate, not be fully aware of how politicised the IPCC report is. And I've got a really good example that a climate scientist told me about a few weeks ago when the IPCC latest roundup of the evidence was coming out. It was to do with the target that people are signed up for to keep the world within 2 degrees of temperatures of pre-industrial times. And I didn't realise this, but he said that one thing that had never been formally agreed was what was meant by pre-industrial times. And he said there was an argument about whether it should be from the 1850s or whether it should be from 1900. And it made about a sort of 0.2%, 0.2 degree difference, which one you took it from. And so it was then sort of after the fact of the sort of science having been put out, it was essentially a political argument about where we're going to draw the baseline. And I think it's really important that when we're reporting science, we are aware of how it's being used, and also that the scientists themselves may or may not have a political agenda. So there can be a sort of awkward juxtaposition between those two things and the demands of the two different disciplines.
One of the things that Tom brought up, I think, was interesting, was the fake formulae.
Oh, yeah.
But do you think that kind of PR fluff is unique problem to science? Is there something about science reporting that makes that kind of stuff more dangerous?
I think it's a unique problem in that it only really seems to happen. I mean, you don't get fake art. You don't get sort of fake reports on albums that haven't happened or something like that, or sports reports of matches that never took place. It only happens in science journalism, and it's because PR firms have realised that there are certain things that any newspaper will latch onto to fill column inches, and that will be anything that says the top 10 whatever's cute animals, I don't know, and there will be any sort of science thing. This survey of 2,000 women say they prefer our product, and then they'll always mention the name of the people who did the survey, and it looks on the page essentially indistinguishable from a scientific report. When there are some genuinely interesting scientific reports into behaviour and all that sort of stuff, which could, if you're just skim reading, look exactly the same as a PR survey. And I think that I think it is a genuine problem because there'll be people who aren't necessarily all that interested in science generally will go through and read and think, oh, bloody boffins talking once again about, whatever. And last week they were telling us eggs were safe, and now they're telling it. And it feeds into this whole general thing. And it's a real problem for journalism in that, firstly, you've got to fill these column inches with these things, but generally speaking, science is about reporting. It should really be about reporting on a body of knowledge that is slowly growing by increments, not this week there's been this big breakthrough. And certainly it shouldn't be about this week a PR firm has reported this. And all of these things feed into a sort of general sense that science is a confused mass that changes every week and doesn't tell us anything interesting. And that's not what it is. I think that, so yes, it is unique. It is both unique and worrying, I think, for science journalism.
I mean, if you read kind of lowbrow newspapers, they're full of nonsense about everything, and I think they don't even. I don't think they seriously suggest to their readers that this stuff's true. You read them kind of as a form of entertainment. No one who seriously wanted to learn about science would read the Mail. And so all really learn about anything would read the Mail. And so when you read the Mail, you're doing something else. It might be quite enjoyable and worthwhile activity. It's just not the one that you want it to be. But and the journalists there are writing for that audience, and they're giving them what they want, and it's all fair enough. And if you want more serious science journalism, it does exist, and there are very good publications aimed at lay readers. So I'd let them have their fun. It's quite harmless. I don't think anybody bases their behaviour on it. I mean, when they read that one of these health stories, silly ones about eggs cause cancer or whatever, I don't think they change their diets. They just giggle.
Perhaps not. I mean, I wish it was only the Mail. I mean, I'm not going to name any newspapers because I work for one. But all of them do it. They do run these same PR surveys, and I think I don't know if it changes people's behaviour, but I think it adds to a general sense that sort of science is just one week and the other, and then it all could be overturned next week. And so there's sort of vague feeling that all of even Newton's theories could be overturned tomorrow, but they're not. It's a sort of general progression towards something that's closer to the truth.
I think just from what Tom was saying, I think I wouldn't agree that it's something that PR surveys sort of uniquely target science, but it does, I think, tell you something about what we like about science, the fact that they know that they can use a formula or a percentage and it'll get in the paper. I think there's something appealing about the idea of having a numerical answer, or something sort of 50% of women say that hair is the most important thing in when they're going to a job interview or something, and the fact that they've only been asked is it your hair or your shoes, it is irrelevant. It's just we've got an answer to what this is, and it's a kind of something that people can quote back to their friends. I think it is quite interesting that it tells you about something about what we seek out in a science story.
But I think there is a problem that science is an inherently unstable basis for public policy. I think you made the point that science grows incrementally. I don't sure it doesn't really grow. It grows through scepticism, through challenge, contestation, refutation. All these. That's the nature of scientific advance. And Ben Goldacre formulated this thing, what he called the first law of bullshit thermodynamics, which is that there is no proposition so absurd that you won't get a science PhD somewhere to endorse it. I wrote a column in the British Journal of General Practice suggesting a rider to that any such proposition can be sure to be supported by at least 5 GPs. And I think there's an inherent problem in science like that. Science has a sort of rational, sceptical character, but it's also, and one element is that it lacks an inspirational dimension, which is one problem in terms of inspiring legitimacy. But because of its contested, conflictual character, that also creates problems because you have inevitably got these controversies. Now, the way that the media and the kind of people who are trying to use science politically, and the media is a victim of this, has to do with is by containing the problem by proclaiming a consensus. To say, the science says this, and then we get this whole kind of rather dogmatic and intolerant exclusion of these heretic, dissident, unpleasant views, which is labelled as denialist, because anybody who possesses them must be castigated as having a psychological problem rather than being in disagreement with the mainstream position. And hence the whole thing kind of answers. But I think that problem arises, the need to deal with, to limit contestation in that way, to limit disagreement, arises from the fact that science itself is not a stable way of motivating official government policy in any of these areas for some of the reasons that Jamie indicated earlier. It's way beyond its comfort zone.
But I think what science does in all cases is to say, show me. And the key thing about science is it's provisional and it relies on publishing your data so that others can challenge it. And going back to what Hannah said earlier that I think was very important is actually it does suggest that actually scrutinising the data that is claimed as the basis for government policy or whatever, is a very important role for journalists. And back to the problem of policy-based evidence, one of the huge problems of policy-based evidence is an awful lot of this evidence that is claimed to be in support of policies is never actually published. And I'm very taken with an idea that the Alliance for Useful Evidence, a body that's been recently set up by Nesta, has come up with, which is the idea that really every policy should have a kind of red book behind it as the budget does. So whenever the budget is published, this whole ream of supporting evidence is published as well, and the stories you get that come out in the days after the budget are as the journalists go through the red book. That happens far too seldom for other policy matters. If I could just go back to the previous discussion as well for a moment. I don't think that formulae stories are in and of themselves especially damaging. They're a bit of fun. They're kind of idiocy. I hated them. I refused to write them. I shouted at the news desk when they asked me to. But at the same time, nobody's going to die as a result of those stories. I think what's interesting about them, though, is what they show about the sort of esteem in which science is held at sort of almost top level in the media. I think certainly if you look at the experience and backgrounds of people who are at senior levels in the media, you will find hardly anybody who either has a scientific background themselves or, more importantly, has a background in reporting science or environment or health where they've had to grapple with a lot of these issues every day. And I think that is a shame. I think you can see that in the output of a lot of kind of general cultural stuff in the media where science perhaps doesn't have the same voice or same quality of esteem that you get elsewhere. And my favourite illustration of this is the fact that in the last 18 months, Melanie Phillips has been on Question Time more often than all scientists put together, which is really quite astonishing. Will Self, Bonnie Greer, these people are all great on Question Time. I'm not questioning that. It's the idea that actually science wouldn't maybe have a voice that's worth hearing in that. That is, I think, one of the issues.
Can I just quickly object to this idea of all policies having a red book or whatever you called it of the evidence behind them? That proposal is loaded with a certain... That's not a neutral kind of pro-evidence proposal. It assumes a certain approach towards policy making, a certain kind of idea about what good policies are. So let me give a concrete example. Take drug policy. So there's a lot of evidence that's used in drug policy, and it all concerns the harm that drugs do. But that is a very peculiar thing to do. You don't need any evidence to know what the right drug policy is, because you give me all the evidence you want about the harm done by various drugs. Then the question is, does the person who takes the drugs voluntarily benefit more from taking the drug than the harm done? Now, the benefit, of course, is entirely a matter of the amount of pleasure the person gets from taking the drug. So it wouldn't matter what amount of evidence you compiled about the harm done. The person makes a trade-off between that amount of harm, and the good which he receives from taking the drug. There is no need for a policy in this area, and no amount of information you have about how much harm is done can make any difference to the right policy. To say that we should have all this evidence is to assume in advance that the right policy is the one that minimizes health harm. But that's just, that's not, I don't think that's true. And the minute you start saying, oh, we need evidence, you're immediately adopting a certain approach to public policy, one that I, for example, reject.
I actually have
very quickly on this, because I just don't want to get this is a whole other topic as well. So just quickly,
I don't actually disagree entirely in the sense that I would have no problem at all. Whether I agree with it or not is another matter. But I would have no problem at all with a politician who stands up and says, I think we should legalise drugs simply because I believe that that is, on an individual liberty case, the right thing to do. Equally, although I don't agree with them, I have no problem with politicians who stand up and say abortion is wrong because it involves killing people. I happen not to share that ethical framework, but I fully respect those who do. The problem I have is when people who stand up and say that something they have reached for a ethical or philosophical reasons is actually an evidence-based decision. I think we may actually agree on that point.
Well, can I just say on this? I was just showing Tom here at the start my notes on Mark's book, which is very illuminating on this question. I completely agree with Jamie's argument on this. Where the point you make, Mark, is that scientific evidence has proved the value of harm reduction.
Yeah.
Now, that's a category error in the way that Jamie says. You know, that scientific evidence cannot show prove the value of harm reduction. That's an and there's an idea in drug policy that because somebody knows about neurotransmitters and dopaminergic pathways and all that neurobollocks, which actually I don't think sheds any light on any aspect of drug addiction, which a whole discussion we had yesterday. But irrespective, there is an idea that sort of scientific expertise can tell you something about how the government should regulate the use of various drugs is a complete misconception. The two things are completely separate. The idea that one can do the other doesn't. It's just it's an abuse of science. It doesn't help in policy, and
the idea that how much harm a policy causes should be of no interest to that policy. If you can show that drugs, that the criminalisation of drugs causes more harm to societies than the decriminalisation of drugs, then that should be an influence. Surely that should influence policy. I don't see that as a controversial.
Right. So drugs policy and stuff. It is really interesting. I would like to do it, but we don't have enough time. Nearly enough time. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get the audience involved at this point.
My question is about the kind of authoritarianism that you can see in what you might call some of the science lobby. So the example that I'll give is a magazine called What Doctors Don't Tell You, which recently, it kind of publishes things, vaccines are very bad and things like that, but recently people have started campaigning to have supermarkets withdraw it from their shelves. I'm perfectly in favour of evidence-based medicine, but I think that's a pernicious attack on free speech, and I think it shows a really kind of fragile conception of what science is if you have to go out and try and clamp down on your enemies rather than win the argument. What do the panel think?
I did a year in public relations with a pharmaceutical company as a client who can boo now. But looking at how the procedure works, I think a lot of the people we were dealing with kind of forego whether they can call themselves science journalists at all. You know, a big hit was to have the press release copy-pasted, more or less, into the article. If they took the photo as well, that's another hit for the PR company. If the journalist is rewriting the press release, then often the abstract or executive summary of the report from the pharmaceutical company got a rewrite too. But the actual proportion of journalists who even asked for the original report was very small in that market. And this is 4 or 5 years ago. So it's a good case for being very kind of sceptical about the real level of engagement, even with the raw materials. It's a different thing from saying, oh yeah, they misread it. But often you're dealing with the health correspondent of a particular publication, and they're working off 2 A4 sheets of paper that have come out of the PR company. And of course, on the PR side, we've got every interest in going back to the PR company at the end of the month and saying, yeah, well, that's a victory for us. You got it as part of your PR retainer. It would have cost you this much in advertising, and so on. So often, journos are complicit in the process to an extent which they're not even wrongly engaging with the material. They're just recycling what we give them.
We're talking about science journalism. I think there's an important distinction to be made between communicating science and reporting science. Communicating science is what the best science journalists do, where you're explaining a complex science report to a non-expert audience. We really need that, and I admire the people who can do that. Reporting science, I'm a journalist. I write for a serious news service, but not a science journalist service. I try, when I'm reporting on a science report, I reported the IPCC climate study, to treat it as I would any news, an election result, a proposal for a law. The Democrats win the election in America. You wouldn't dream of only giving space to the Democrat position. With a scientific report, you don't have to take an opinion. You just give space to critics of that report. You're accused of being irresponsible because the majority of scientists said one thing, which is what a lot of the panel have been saying. Scientists are treated as this authority that you're not allowed to question. I think if the science reporting, if it was expected that you treat it more like any other subject without doing away for the need for the scientific journalists, I think that would help a lot with the problem you've been touching on. This science is another. It's not like an election result. It's not like a proposal for a law. It's a religion. We can't question this in a country which doesn't allow freedom of speech.
I kind of want to sort of offer an alternative perspective here, because I feel like the root of the problems of science journalism really exists in science itself, especially high-impact science, because the two examples in my mind about this going wrong are Andy Wakefield and the Lombardi XMRV CFS link. Those were both high-impact studies in really big papers, and I kind of feel like science is obsessed with being right, and it isn't prepared to sort of pursue knowledge for knowledge's sake. I mean, anybody who's been in the academic field would know that when you write your grant application for money to do your science, you claim it cures cancer, does something about male pattern baldness, and does everything else. And I feel like these problems in science journalism really sort of have their root in the sensationalism that exists within science, and I feel like we should perhaps acknowledge that grants are given out not necessarily based on evidence, but rather based on policy. So it's really is a self-perpetuating problem, isn't it?
Okay, I'm going to, the gentleman just right beside you, and then I'm going to come back, and then I'll take some more. We've got plenty of time.
I'm not a science journalist. I'm a Brussels correspondent for the same newspaper that Tom works for, and I find I have to deal with a lot of evidence-based policy, a lot of numbers, and one of the things that I find very useful is my instinctive mistrust of all policy, I suppose, and my particular instinctive mistrust of policy that comes attached with evidence. And I think that this is borne out by wider experience. If you look at, for example, the debate about minimum alcohol pricing, you'll find that there's a huge body of overwhelming evidence to show that this would reduce alcohol harm reduction, and the evidence-based policy people say, therefore, we should introduce minimum alcohol policies immediately. Most people have an instinctive dislike for this because they're making the balance between being able to have a nice cheap can of beer at home and other people being able to do that and having it forbidden to them. So I think much more important than evidence quite often, or the evidence that is presented with a policy, are our own instincts and also the instincts of other people. And there have been a lot of bad policies, a lot of very destructive policies in terms of people's freedoms and the way in which they live their lives, where if we'd gone with our instincts and other people's instincts, we could have avoided it.
So, panel, there's quite a lot there. Mike, would you like to start?
Can I just come in very quickly on the what doctors don't tell you question? I've had a debate with I can't remember her name now, the editor of What Doctors Don't Tell You. And I completely agree with your point that we should be strongly opposed to the censorship of absolutely scurrilous and rubbish publication. But I think the point about it, and I offered actually in the course of the discussion at an anti-vaccine conference, I offered actually to have a formal debate with her, which she turned down. Much to my disappointment, rather in the same spirit, I've recently been turned down. Andy Wakefield announced that he was prepared to debate the ongoing issues of the MMR controversy, and I was the only person that accepted it. Once I accepted it, he found some other reason not to engage in the argument. But that also goes back to reminding of back at the start of the MMR controversy, not that had the height of the MMR controversy, when there was people may remember Wakefield was the subject of this hagiographical Channel 5 documentary, Hear the Silence, in which he was depicted as the heroic doctor, listening to all that stuff. It was that sort of high point of the campaign. And the Channel 5 and Channel 4 were feeling under defence of that. They felt obliged to organise a debate about it. And what was interesting about the debate was there was a complete embargo put on participation in it on anybody involved in the world of medicine or science. Everybody completely refused to engage in the debate on the grounds that that basically if we ignored him he would go away, and that it would just give him more publicity. And it was just an evasion of the arguments that had been raised. And the problem, the only people, just for the record here, the only people who had agreed to go on that programme was me, Evan Harris, the Liberal Democrat MP as he was then, and the courageous Anjana Ahuja of the Times newspaper. But the entire scientific and medical establishment dodged that debate at that time. And that's the spirit of this general thing, is that if you ignore it or try and suppress it, that's the way to deal with controversies in this area. It just doesn't work, and it's patronising, it's condescending to people. And the point that you can't get away from it, and the reason why I'm prepared to engage in these discussions with people I fundamentally disagree with, is because there are many parents out there in the world of people looking at concerned about vaccinations, and people in the world of autism who still accept some validity in these theories. As long as that is the case, then it's an argument that's worth having and should be engaged. And the more publicity it gets, the more debate there is about it, the more what doctors don't tell you, whatever it's called, is widely available, the better.
On the What Doctors Don't Tell You, which was something we wrote about in the Times a few weeks ago. I don't know if you saw it. And it was basically about writing about a campaign to have the magazine withdrawn from Tesco and various other supermarkets who were selling it. And it's basically a magazine that has things like, could vitamin C cure AIDS and cancer? And that's the kind of stuff that's in there. And I'd agree with you. I think that it's important that people should be able to write about that. If that's, if they think that that's a possibility, they should be able to write about it, even if it's completely bonkers. But I think it's completely valid for people, on the other hand, to put pressure on supermarkets and ask them, is this what you want to be selling your customers? You could do the same thing with, sort of porn magazines. Do you want to see that in Tesco? It's not the same as saying you want it to be banned, but I think it's reasonable to put pressure on a retailer not to sell it. And the other thing to just mention on that, I think while you should be allowed to publish a magazine giving your opinion on these things, it's important that accuracy is upheld. So even in a magazine like that, if someone's sort of making up facts and figures about studies, then they should be held to account. And it does seem as though the editorship of the magazine is quite cavalier when it comes to facts, because they've been well, they've sort of put out their own YouTube campaign against my colleague Tom, who wrote the article, saying that he didn't contact them and all of this, when he sort of sent them about 5 emails and phoned them up. So I think that's kind of one thing that accuracy is important, even if you're going to sort of give slightly off-the-wall opinions on things, whatever they might be.
Just to that fringe groups are often very quick, I think, to claim censorship, when in fact many would argue that in fact they get rather disproportionate time in the media compared to the proportion with which their views are held in the scientific community. I wanted to pick up as well, though, on the point made about press releases and so on, because I think it's a really interesting one. I think your particular example, sir, about the drug industry, probably you were talking more about sector press probably than national press. I mean, I think wholesale lifting and re-reporting of press releases in the national papers is low, but re-churning and rewriting is high volume in many parts of the national press. But I think what this tells you in some ways is actually that the elephant in the room here is in fact any problems that afflict science journalism are just a subset of the problems that afflict journalism and the newspaper industry and indeed the whole media industry in general here. And I mean, we are talking about a situation here where the overwhelming majority of news organisations that are not state-supported, i.e. not the BBC, are in real crisis at present. I mean, the Times and the Guardian are losing phenomenal amounts of money a year. The FT and the Telegraph are just about profitable, but by the FT, by doing obviously a sort of paywall approach, and the Telegraph by, while still publishing excellent reporters such as Tom, certain aspects of their news operation are what one might describe as commodified. And certainly if you look at the one newspaper that is really profitable at the moment in the Daily Mail, and especially what they do online, they have not gone for what one might describe as high-quality value-added journalism, shall we say. And I think this is a real problem, and that actually we all despair of people who do of journalists who do, as you have said. But the reality in many newsrooms, on online outlets, trade press, and some newspapers, is that journalists are being asked to write 8 stories a day, feeding the content-hungry beast in order to get unique users and clicks, in order to sell pay-per-click advertising. And frankly, that is a huge structural problem for the industry that nobody has a really good answer to yet. And pretty much everything else we discuss here is kind of moot if those basic financial problems of the industry are not tackled.
Tom?
I will respond in my paper's defence a bit. A lot of the reason why we're profitable is because we still sell lots of newspapers, but admittedly it's because we've got we've got our readership is somewhat older, and so it doesn't give so always read. But that, I think it's not just that we commodify things. I want to defend the poor old Telegraph a bit there. Is one of you were talking about communicating versus reporting and the importance of balance and so on, and you said that in reporting we should have the mainstream view and also a critical view, and I agree with you entirely, but that I think you drew a false parallel a bit, because you're suggesting that or maybe you didn't. Maybe you didn't specifically say what examples you're thinking of, but I mean, my mind immediately went to climate, and I assume everyone else's did as well. That you're sort of thinking, because we have the IPCC report, we should therefore have Christopher Monckton or someone mad talking about it as well. And that's how we do it when we're reporting political journalism. And so that's not how we do it when we do political journalism. We get the mainstream, we get the government view, for instance, then we get the opposition view, which is not the same as getting the government view and the natural law party view or something like that. You don't go and get a mainstream one and then some complete lunatic from the very fringes. So I do want to say that the same debate actually goes on all the time in political things about whether or not we should get, for example, UKIP into the leaders' debates. In the how mainstream do you have to be before you get a voice in some of the main in the media, and it's a complicated debate, and it's one with lots of sort of grey areas and nuances. But I do think that just because we have the main body of evidence, or the main sort of scientific body saying there is loads of evidence that the world is warming, we shouldn't get someone in to say, no, carbon dioxide is actually plant food and it's brilliant. That's my response to that.
I want to challenge this idea a bit that there's a problem here. You're science journalists, I'm not, so you're more inclined to see a problem than I am. If people aren't willing to pay, your average reader of an average newspaper doesn't care about the science journalism very much. If you care about science journalism a lot, you'll probably buy one of the specialist magazines, Scientific American, something like that. And, you know, what you're finding is that people aren't willing to pay extra for the newspapers to have higher quality science journalism. If they were, newspapers would provide that and charge a higher price. They're in for profit. Now, you lament this, and you might come up with kind of higher order arguments. You might say, well, the population needs to care about science and understand it and so on. But honestly, I don't think any level of science journalism in an everyday newspaper is going to teach people about science. If you want to teach people about science, it probably better happen at school. And most consumption of science is not through learning about the content of science, it's by the use of the output of science. So I think most people have a very high opinion of science because they understand that their everyday lives depend on it. You know, they're on the internet, they've got these fridges, they're wearing clothes made by machines, and that's as far as it needs to go. And I'm not really, for most people, what's it matter? Why is there really a problem here?
There's a problem sometimes if for example, you get, I mean, we go on about the Gillian McKeiths of the world, whatever, and sort of the quack stuff over here, and it is a bit of a joke, and it doesn't matter that much, and they will take their homeopathic pills until they break their leg and go to hospital, and that's fine. But it does matter in places like South Africa where there's AIDS and people trying to cure major epidemics using vitamin C or garlic or, you know, and that the two problems do feed. You're not going to fix that
in the newspaper.
No, but you can edge towards it. You can shift the balance a bit towards saying, look, no, this stuff is nonsense. This stuff is possibly not nonsense. This stuff definitely isn't nonsense. You know, and you can show with a bit of work the sort of the gradations of it all. And yes, it's complex. And yes, there's some areas where, like as you totally rightly say, where the science isn't as clear-cut as sometimes people make it out, and we say, you know, there's that awful headlines saying science shows that we're all. I've got too many examples for it, but you know, but there is nonetheless. I think saying that it's completely harmless and we don't need to worry about the falsification or the misrepresentation of science at all is just not a problem. I don't think that's true, and I think you can actually point to bodies in sub-Saharan Africa because of that.
Which you can, in some part, lay at the door of the Sunday Times campaign of the mid-80s.
Yeah. Yes.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to go out and get some more questions because there was lots of hands.
To support Jamie's comments about sort of three different areas of science, I think this comes from Jerry Revetz's book on scientific knowledge and its social problems, written 40 years ago. I just actually got around to reading it recently. I mean, there are scientific questions which science can answer, and they become facts. There are technical problems that we can deal with, and science can feed into those. And then there are practical problems where science is asked to comment. And over the last 40 years, I think people have relied more on that. And there are many areas that now call themselves science, so trying to associate themselves with the harder sciences of physics and chemistry, which is full of facts, but they're not. And as pointed out earlier, there's a lot of uncertainty in many of the newer sciences. There are very few things you would call facts. And read his book if you want to understand that. But he talked about what has happened in a whole range of sciences, from the social sciences. He didn't talk about climate science, but that would be also part of that. And I think that's part of the job of journalists and science journalists in particular, to point that out. Not all science is the same in relation to the facts.
To make it a little bit more scientific, I want to ask the panel whether they think that the coverage of science issues that are policy related, like climate change, medical and health issues and so on, whether that's any worse than the coverage in the press of broader science questions, which have no immediate policy implications. I mean, as somebody who's interested in science and a science fiction writer and so on, I do pay some attention to the science journalism in newspapers, and it's almost uniformly rubbish. Paleontology, astronomy, they always get it wrong. I remember in one respectable newspaper just a few years ago, and as an example that stuck in my mind, somebody thought that Ichthyosaurus was a mammal. Somebody else, the same journalist in fact, a quite reasonable science journalist, said that nanotechnology dealt with particles so small that the laws of physics didn't apply to them.
Thank you. I just wanted to say on the very early topic of sort of educating the people to read these science articles, and possibly the reason that some people may view science articles in popular newspapers as being dumbed down is because it's actually acceptable to not understand science and maths. To be honest, yes, there are people that don't understand complex physics or beyond A-level mathematics, but at the same time, there are people willing to ask for help, and where I've experienced this is bizarrely on the news forum reddit.com, where they have the science news subreddit, where you get these articles published straight onto the web, where people then discuss them. And if someone doesn't understand something, I remember it was only yesterday someone was asking whether or not this could physically happen, and it turned out he was something like a construction worker that had no formal education in science at all. He was asking what this meant for him. He got a reply from someone working fairly high up in the structure of NASA explaining it. And so people do understand things, and I think people, when they don't understand them, are more willing to go out and search for answers rather than be spoon-fed make-believe and fairy tale.
There's been a variety of problems raised, both in science reporting, and in public understanding. Whose responsibility is it to solve these? Do the scientists have to stop accepting money to do partisan studies? Do journalists have to have more selectivity about what they report and only report things they think are properly evidence-based and proper science? Or does the public have to be more aware
All
and
the
say,
above.
I'll only read it?
All the above.
I think a very important question was raised in the last round that hasn't been fully grappled with, and I'd like to push it. It was about sensationalism within science. I'm not talking about in press releases, I'm not talking about in science journalism, I'm talking about in science. I wonder whether it's possible to conduct science well, be it incrementally or be it via contestation and refutation, when it is such a predominant source of authority for political decisions, and when it's relied, and when its impact factor is relied upon for funding. I mean, if I was a climatologist right now, I'd be on Prozac. Yes, all of the above, but the science itself, if you look at, abstracts of journal articles, it's a well-known fact that their last sentence is often something of a non sequitur, repeating a well-established fact about the field which is liable to be misconstrued and spotted by a journalist or play into some aspect of a current political or public discussion. And there's no doubt that papers are written and discussed and thought about with the policy context in mind. This doesn't all happen chronologically or logically prior to a press release and journalism and policy discussion. The things are very much bound up together, and the mechanisms of science, peer review and so on, they're not necessarily an effective insulation from that. I don't say this because I want to be cynical, throw away science, we shouldn't rely upon it. I'm just saying that if we lean on it to this extent, we will kill it. Evidence-based policy is not just doesn't just have problematic consequences for policy. The consequences for science are worth considering as well.
Thing I think may be happening, the chap who talked about the internet made me think this in your comments. I used to be a management consultant, and one of the things that's happened in management consulting is that the so-called generalist model of management consulting has been replaced by a specialist model. Clients don't want anymore to get people who think they know all about all kinds of business turning up with the platitudinous lines and charging millions of dollars for it. They want people who are specialists in their field. Now, newspapers may be facing a problem along these lines, which is that, the old idea, we all watch the BBC, we all read the Telegraph or the Times, and we're going to all get this generalist stuff coming to us. Society's not quite so much like that now, and some people have got serious interests in certain particular areas, and they want to go to places that supply them well and not to generalist suppliers. And I think the internet is, speeding this process. And I think that some of what you're saying are a problem in science journalism may well be solved by this kind of a market mechanism, by the death of these generalist outlets and more specialization.
It's an interesting point, and I largely agree with it. I think the sadness of that, what you lose in that, is the serendipity of the general interest, the coming across things you didn't know you were interested in. And we see this, especially in the US media, with the way that everybody gets their news entirely from politicized media that reflects their prejudices in the first instance. Just two short things just to take up from Craig's edict here. First of all, just on the point about the mistakes that get made, there was a fabulous one in The Guardian last week, actually, when Polly Toynbee wrote actually rather a good column about genes and intelligence following the Dominic Cummings revelations. But the headline was "Class is more heritable than genes," which I thought was absolutely phenomenal. But I think that goes back to my point about esteem. The kind of mistakes that would simply not be tolerated in the reporting of sport or business, for example, are, I think, tolerated in science in newspapers much, much more. And then just to pick up on Sandy's point, I think you're right that there are some really interesting questions for science as a whole at the moment about how the tyranny of the impact... Does everybody understand what the impact factor is? Or should I... Okay, I can see some shaking heads. So impact factor is a measure of the importance of a journal in which science is published, based on the average number of times that the papers published in that journal are cited by other papers. So it's a measure of the importance. It's an absolutely atrocious measure of quality in science, yet it is hugely pervasive and powerful. And it means that the three journals with the highest impact factor, Science and Nature and Cell, have absolutely disproportionate impact, because to publish in one of those journals basically makes a scientist's career. And it does, and it is undeniably the case that those journals publish sexy science. And Science in particular has run into a number of scandals lately where they have published and had to retract a number of papers that have been very sexy but simply wrong. The one, for example, about life based on arsenic rather than phosphorus would be a good example of that. And I think, I personally think, and this is the Wellcome Trust's view strongly as well, is that actually open access publishing is a very important thing that will change that ecosystem. The post-publication peer review coming to complement pre-publication peer review. I wouldn't say we have all the answers, but I would say that this is at least a question that is acknowledged in science. And for all of the criticisms that have been made of science today, and I think most of them have an element of validity, the incredibly powerful thing about science is nobody is working harder to address those than scientists themselves. How many walks of life can you actually say that about?
Could I just add in on the point that Sandy and the guy in the red T-shirt made about whether science has a problem, whether science itself is sensationalist. I was in Zurich this week at the IBM labs, and we had a briefing with Henry Markram, who is leading something called the Human Brain Project. And he's been given €1 billion to lead this project to simulate a human brain inside a supercomputer. And if you were seeking a scientist who is a complete showman, very sensationalist, he is your man. And he's been given, there's two projects in the European Union that have been given this €1 billion funding, and he's one of them. And I do think that some of the claims that he makes about what the project is going to do. I was speaking to another neuroscientist on Friday, and he just described it as absurd. But I think there is also something compelling about someone who's got this massive vision and is so excited about it, and kind of paints this picture of what he can potentially achieve with this simulated brain. That you can, there is something attractive about that as well, and he has managed to get an awful lot of people behind this project, and regardless of whether it achieves some of the grander goals that he's laid out, it probably will lead to a massive advance in our understanding of the brain and in neuroscience, just because so many people are collaborating behind a single goal, and for the first time sort of sharing data in this massive collaboration. So I don't know, in some ways it's just part of human nature, wanting to sort of show off and sensationalise things, and there's good things and bad things about that.
I think there is a problem about science in the media, but it doesn't start in the media, and it is about the role science is called upon to play in society. It's amplified in the media, and it's dramatised in the media, and it has a major impact through the media, but it doesn't start there. It starts in the wider role that, as I say, science has been called upon to play in legitimating public policy. Now, one of the aspects of that is the instrumental manipulation of science in the pursuit of different sorts of policy. And, as a GP, I've lived through, sometimes I look back, I'm amazed my patients are still alive. In the time I've been in general practice, there was a strong scientific consensus that the patient population was going to be decimated on several occasions by HIV/AIDS, by BSE mad cow disease, CJD, by bird flu, by pandemic flu. These were major public health scaremongering was engaged upon around these issues, with the science authoritatively proclaimed that these were going to decimate the population unless people took very drastic actions, and apart from a vast amount of money being wasted and resources around these sort of scares, it did have a major impact on public life and on patients, and created a tremendous amount of anxieties. And I think that's why somebody said, does it really matter that most of the stuff in all the papers is rubbish? It's true, but there are wider consequences of this sort of manipulative, moralising use of science in this way, which one of the famous justifications for going back to the HIV/AIDS policy in Britain was that it was the good lie. That there was never any serious risk of it becoming a major threat in British society, but the government launched the Tombstones and Icebergs campaign. It was the good lie because it was supposed to encourage people into a form of sexual behaviour which everybody thought they ought to be engaging in. There was no scientific basis for that, but it was considered to be what the government wanted. Therefore, the science was produced to legitimise that sort of policy. Now, that, I'm afraid, is a sort of approach to the use of science in relation to public policy is very widespread, and it has very damaging consequences both for science and for the public. One of the reasons I might be to go back to the what doctors don't tell you question, I might be a bit sensitive to this thing, because I wrote a pamphlet in 1987 critical of the HIV/AIDS government policy at the time, which there was a campaign to have removed from the bookshelves of many shops. And so I'm very wary of censorship around these sorts of issues because I've personally experienced it.
Policymakers, and indeed everyone, from creationists to pro-abortion, anti-abortion, everything, you can find a paper to support it, because science is enormous and there are millions and millions of papers, and confirmation bias being what it is, you will find the one that supports your case and you will push that, and it can be, however ludicrous it is, not only can you find a PhD student and 5 GPs, you can also find a peer-reviewed scientific paper to cover it. And that problem of complexity, in my opinion, makes good science journalism, makes good sort of science features and comment writing, and all the explaining the uncertainty and the nuance and the complexity of these issues, and saying, no, it's not a clear-cut thing. No, the fact that one science paper has come out, one research paper has come out saying this does not mean that is the case. Explaining basically the idea of p-values and false positives and all these sort of things. Just saying, that's the value of good science journalism right there, I think.
Do you think there's a pressure on journalists from various sources, from proprietors? Probably not you here, but lower down. Also, subjectively, you write what the readers want to read, and also the pressure to keep something simple. So if you come in, you say this is the P factor and there's uncertainty, your sub-editor will throw it back to you and say, please, this isn't going to interest our readers. We want something punchy, and rather, if you like, than accurate.
This is more of just a comment on what I think someone said before, was that they believe people don't care about science because it works in their everyday life. But I think it's further than that, and I flip it and go, the only reason it works in their everyday life is because people don't care about it, in the sense that the only thing that actually works because people don't care about it is mathematics, which is that incarcerated transcendental subject where it is literally made up, but it just so happens to work. But with science is this thing which is applied into our physical world, but until we continue our falsification of science, we are confining ourselves. For example, I use quantum physics, Young's double slit experiment. Through observation, the results actually change, and then it puts scientists in a position where they can't explain their science anymore, and all they can say about science is, it just so happens to work. We do not know why it works, but it just so happens to work. Right. They try to explain consciousness. So science is in a position where philosophy needs to step in.
Hello. I'd like to say that I'm personally hurt, nay, disgusted by the concept that I would not wish to be educated by reading science journalism. I read journalism and newspapers to learn something. I would love for science journalism and other to be cheerleaders for scientific method, which is a philosophical concept and not something that I believe is exclusive to scientists. And I suspect that the lack of an understanding of scientific method in journalists is a reason for mutual mistrust between journalists and academics. I would love to hear the panel's comments.
My problem with the discussion is that, I'm a scientist, and first of all, I have no time for journalists who's arguing that they can't have the scientific facts correct. Like any other jobs, you do your job properly. So if you're not a scientist, you go and get the data from the scientist to explain to you. But my main discussion is that the discussion about science, it seems to be, it's a bit like saying, it's not my opinion, it's the science saying something. So why not saying that it's your opinion? On the discussion about the climate change, for example, some people disagree with the consensus, the same as in science. We know that we have data, the scientists interpret data, they disagree with each other. There is nothing wrong with that. So why is it that when people are, discussing in journals or in the media, they don't upfront saying, this is my opinion, instead of saying, this is a science saying?
I'm not particularly worried, actually, about scientific journalists talking to scientists. I'm much more worried about the tyranny of facts that as they're presented, the way that we now have kind of evidence based on what they wanted the policy to be. I'm just an old-fashioned local hack. I can make my excuses and leave from a brothel, buy a gun in a pub, not done much particle physics. But even I know, when I read things from a local council like, as a result of a crackdown on drink in public places, we're very pleased. And then the actual study that they've done of their own figures says they doubled the number of people now hanging about in the park. And it just goes on. 2 out of 3 women in this borough are abused. And you ask them, why did you write that? What was the, how did you arrive at this figure? They won't tell you, right? It's very, very difficult to do this. You don't, and a lot of these people are reporting on it actually aren't even journalists. At least I've been trained to do something, but a lot of people are not. I think that's the big problem. The idea that any kind of fact you can bring. My local council, the Green one, has...
No, so we don't have time for stories.
They say that they think they should bring in acupuncture for use in infertility because of scientific evidence in China. Right. Now, come on.
You see this in debates all the time on any topic now. Somebody suggests a solution to a problem, someone else says, what's your evidence for that? Which is a rhetorical move because it's talking about the future and there is no evidence yet. So what would be a much more useful question would be to ask, what are your reasons for that? Which allows scope for values, ideas, logic, other things to come in, the sorts of thing that Michael was talking about earlier. So I think there's too much evidence and not enough reason.
It's just on Mark's point from way back about engineers and scientists not appearing on Question Time enough. And I think, I'm an engineer, I think there should be more on there. But there's an element of, if they do go on there, they've presumably got to talk about things that are totally unpopular. Like, they've got to argue, if they believe it, say that they don't think there should be gay marriage or something like that. So I just wonder if there are that many people who are kind of prepared to do that, who are scientists, without then thinking they've undermined their credibility as a scientist by coming up with something that's totally unpopular on another plane, if that makes any sense.
I'm a bit concerned about the way that science journalism treats the audience that it's writing for, in the sense that, what if they don't accept your arguments that are based on credible science because they don't want to, they've got another viewpoint that they want to take? How do you deal with that? Do you just treat the audience as if they're silly because they don't understand the science, or do you delve into the argument that might be behind the policy that you're looking at? So MMR argument related to people's fears about science and trust and authority, not just the science.
I like your point about do we get forced into writing stuff that interests the readers. And I just want to say, Charles Darwin wrote at least 2 books that I know of. He wrote Origin of the Species, and he also wrote The Formation of Leaf Mould Through the Action of Worms. You can just know which one was the bigger seller, don't you? And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Writing stuff that's interesting and is of relevance to people's lives is fine. And yes, there is sometimes pressure from the news desk to come on sort of sex up the facts a bit. But generally speaking, yes, we do write stuff that people will be interested in that sells more papers because that's more interesting and it sells more papers. And I think that's fine, as long as the facts themselves are okay.
Yeah, just an example. There was a report published, reported in several papers about 6 months ago, claiming a link between some scientific study had shown a link between traffic pollution and autism. And it was in the same week as there was another study showing a link between lead and crime and this familiar sort of thing. I mean, I often say this is a preserve of the Daily Mail. None of these reports are in the Daily Mail. They were all in the broadsheet newspapers. And one of the interesting things about the pollution autism report, when it was put back to one of the scientists involved in one of the leading Cambridge research places in relation to autism, made the point, agree, yes, the evidence is very weak, and it's an association rather than a causation, but we're all opposed to traffic pollution, so we can agree with it that it's a useful thing to put out. And so it doesn't really matter if the science is crap, we're all against pollution, so we'll go along with it. And I think that's because it does matter, actually, because it matters in relation to the science, it matters in relation to the public impact that those sort of statements have. And I think one of the very good sections of Mark's book is a section on evidence abuse, and it provides a very useful example of the abuse of evidence in this sort of way. And the criteria by which scientists can judge whether a particular environmental factor can be accepted as having a causative relation to any particular disease are very well established. The famous Austin-Bradford Hill criteria, 9 points. He was the one that, with Richard Doll, discovered the lung cancer smoking link. It's a very simple thing. All these associations, which are reported everywhere, it's a very familiar feature. They usually meet either none or one of Bradford Hill's 9 criteria. So it's not rocket science to dismiss them. But what's interesting is that the problem of and this is my conclusion to a plea to science journalists, would be to apply their rigour about scientific abuse, not so much in relation to things that they're generally in favour of, like vaccines or action against climate change, but in relation to some other things which they may not be very sympathetic towards, like smoking or screening or supposed links between diet and health, and promote some application of the principles of evidence abuse to some of the claims around these sort of things.
Thanks, Mike. Hannah, you got final thoughts?
Yeah. So on the evidence point, there's been a few people sort of criticising this idea that you can, that drive policy with evidence, but I think, if you're going to sort of make an evidence-based claim about your policy, then that's when it really has to be right. And I think, there's people doing some great stuff, kind of checking up those claims now. The Open Data Institute in London's just started a couple of really good projects looking at things like whether decisions close whether the right fire stations were closed down based on sort of claims about, coverage. On question time, I think it would actually be really helpful to have scientists on there and for them to be asked views sort of outside science, just to kind of challenge this idea that there's a sort of scientific priesthood that just have answers for things. I think it'd be quite nice to see that scientists, just kind of people who've got opinions on politics and social values and sense of humour and that kind of thing. And I can think of loads of scientists who'd be really good. So I think I don't think it should undermine the credibility as a scientist. I think it should just convey a better sense of what scientists are like. And then I wanted to say on the p-values in articles, I can't remember who asked about that, but I actually had a p-value in my article yesterday on a study about the health impact of eating deep-fried Mars bars. So we do get them in sometimes if they're relevant and we have enough space.
I think there have been a lot of questions assume there's a sort of problem that needs to be fixed here. And although I certainly am upset, as you know, by a lot of the stuff going around in evidence-based policy, I don't really think there's any problem with science or the public understanding of science. I mean, science itself progresses marvelously. I don't think there's too much to worry about there. It's forging ahead. There's great applied and fundamental research going on. Scientific standards aren't slipping in some way. Now, I think that, of course, there have been scares that have been unjustified. There have been erroneous stories that have actually led people maybe to take the wrong actions and harm themselves. But I think that to worry too much about this and think that we need some kind of structural solution, some kind of policy solution to all this, is falling prey to utopianism. You can't expect that's, we do pretty well by historical standards and looking around the world. The current state of business and science and the public understanding of science and the use of science in society is amazingly good. And we shouldn't expect it to be perfect. It's never going to be perfect, and that's one of the reasons it's never going to be perfect is because of the very nature of science. Science proceeds to some extent by a method of trial and error. And error, right? It's going to be full of error. And there are going to be periods where we don't know what the answer is, and people are going to act mistakenly. But to think that this is something that needs a solution is to have a kind of crazy utopian idea. It's going well. I wouldn't mess with it.
Thanks, Jimmy. And Mark, your final thoughts.
So two points to pick up on. First of all, your point about evidence and reasons I thought was actually rather a good one. I am, as you will know, certainly if you've read my book, a big advocate of what I would perhaps better call evidence-informed policy than evidence-based policy. But I'm also the first, and I hope my book is very clear on this, a strong advocate of evidence not being the only thing that is one of the factors that has to be taken into account. And I think one of the problems with discourse around this in policy and politics particularly is that politicians who have reached certain conclusions for non-evidence-based reasons, for reasons of ethics or ideology or whatever, then feel compelled to frame them in terms of evidence. And that actually, I think, then devalues the evidence as well. It actually, I think, leads to a lot of the problems that worry Jamie and worry Mike. It's actually partly a misframing of the debate in the first place. And I think your idea about asking for reasons is a very good one, because evidence can, of course, be one of those reasons, but it doesn't have to be the only one. And I think that's important. Finally, I just want to pick up on your excellent question about do we write what people want to read, to which the answer has to be a resounding yes. But there are different ways of doing that. You can write what people want to read by going for the Daily Mail sidebar of shame approach, or you can write what people want to read by trusting the reader, by feeling that the reader is happy to be challenged and happy to be informed about something perhaps they didn't previously understand, to be engaged with in a two-way basis as well. And I want to come back, and I think it's a great place to finish. Any of you who haven't read it, look up on the Guardian website the great Tim Radford's Rules for the Simple Scribe. Tim Radford was the science editor of the Guardian for many years, now retired. It's a phenomenal list of how to write about science. In fact, I think you can apply his rules to writing about anything, of which I want to focus. I want to just finish with just two of these rules. The first one, actually I'll make it three. The first one is that nobody will ever complain that you have made something too simple to understand. The second one is you should never overestimate the reader's knowledge or underestimate their intelligence. And the third one, which I think is really something that every hack should have inscribed above their desk, is nobody has to read this crap.
Thank you very much, Mark. It's a very difficult topic, I think, very wide-ranging, lots of things to grapple with. Thank you very much for your questions. Could we thank our panel, please?